Hello, everyone. This is the False Bible Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Denton. My guest today is Matt Johnson. Matt is a writer whose most recent book is How Hitchens Can Save the Left, Rediscovering Fearless Liberalism. He's also contributed to outlets such as Haaretz, The Bulwark, Quillette, and many others. You can also check him out on Substack. His most recent essay being Bracing for the Post-Liberal International Order, which I actually listened to that one, which is cool on Substack, how you can listen to, so I can multitask. But I'm actually, before we get into what we wanted to talk about, I wanted to start, Matt, with this recent piece on your Substack. Again, it's Bracing for the Post-Liberal International Order. In that piece, you analyze Noam Chomsky's newest book along with his co-writer, and they're basically and you actually are distinguishing and sometimes just explaining the overlap between Chomsky's worldview, which is I don't know what you it's like anti-American leftist like
That's how I
liberal.
describe it. I mean, it's
Yeah,
obviously that's a very polemical way to describe it. But I've
right.
tried other labels like anti-imperialist, and I actually mentioned this in the footnote, but I feel like that grants his premise.
Right.
So yeah. The only way to do
Yeah,
it was to just come right out with it and say like, yeah, anti-Americanism.
that's a good point. And then you couple that with John Muir. Is it John Mearsheimer?
Mearsheimer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Mearsheimer, and his views, which are, how would you describe John Mearsheimer?
Well, he's a realist. That's just a school of
Right.
thought
Yeah.
in international relations, and him and Stephen Walt are two of the best known contemporary realists. And they've written a lot of articles and books about realism as a theory, about realism in practice. They both came out with books, I think, around 2018. Walt's was called The Hell of Good Intentions, and Mearsheimer's was called The Great Delusion. And they were
Mm.
basically arguing that this period of liberal hegemony, which is, the post-Cold War period of American dominance in the world, has been a catastrophe. And I roundly disagree with them about that. And they also wrote this book called The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy,
Mm.
which I took to task in Quillette a little while back. But we can get into whatever on those fronts.
Yeah, I'm interested in that. And then also you overlap both of those with, and you show they all have similarities, and then they have differences with the America First movement that we're currently seeing. As far as
Yeah.
this goes, though, could you talk about, give us sort of a synopsis of this article, because it's going to kind of get us into what we want to talk about to begin with anyways, which is the liberal international order and how America seems to be retreating from that. Not seems to be, they actually are retreating from
Yeah.
it. And
Sure.
so what's your thesis there in that particular article?
So the central thing I was trying to accomplish with that article was to ask the members of those three categories: realists, anti-American leftists, and Trumpists, America Firstists. What's their end goal? Like what world do they want to live in? I mean,
Mm.
if you ask Chomsky, he would probably say something like a dramatic reduction in the U.S. defense budget. He would argue that the United States isn't just overextended around the world. He thinks that we're this imperial colossus that wreaks havoc everywhere we go. So presumably that would mean folding up the nuclear security umbrella over Europe and East Asia. That would presumably mean not having U.S. military bases in South Korea, Japan, Germany. So just pull the United States out of these places. And my question to him is, what does he think would happen? I mean, does that increase or decrease the chances that Taiwan will be invaded by China? Does it increase or decrease the likelihood of Putinist aggression in Europe? And I would argue that it just makes the world far more dangerous and far less
Mm.
stable. And then I would just put the same argument to the realists and the only group of those three that kind of has some nuance and might have a case to be made for themselves as the realists, because they do recognize the power and importance of balancing competing interests and powers in the world. And I think, Mearsheimer said at one point in a recent essay or I think interview in The Economist that he thought NATO should have won the Nobel Peace Prize instead of the EU because it was this important check on Russian
Mm.
power. But then at the same time, he blames NATO for the invasion of Ukraine. He says NATO is completely to blame for boxing Putin in and making him feel threatened, even though Putin was saying when he first took power that he could see Russia eventually joining NATO.
Hmm.
So yeah, but the basic goal of the article was to get people to explain what kind of world they want to live in. And I just don't think I don't think they have an affirmative vision. I don't think they have a positive vision. They have this anti-American and anti-Western view, like, oh, we've just been this dominant hyperpower. The United States has been this dominant imperial monstrosity for 30 uh, years and change, and they have no alternative. So yeah.
Right. What's the could you give a clear distinction between international realism versus international idealism, just so people can understand what these terms are here?
Yeah, well, I mean, realism, you have to remember that that word refers to the specific academic theory. It's not like realism in the abstract, as if just like taking the world as it is, being pragmatic. I mean, I would argue that my view of the world is more realistic than the realist view of the world, because
Right.
they think that states are like billiard balls. That's actually how John Mearsheimer describes it. He thinks that
Deterministic. Yeah.
yes, their
Yeah.
behavior is governed by mindless physical forces, and I don't think that. I think state behavior is governed by history, by the personalities of individual leaders, by ideologies, by countless things, and the distribution of power in the international system. But to say that Germany would behave the same no matter who's ruling it is utter and complete nonsense. Hitler and
Mm.
Angela Merkel are quite different. Hitler and
Mm.
Olaf Scholz are quite different. So it's just
Right.
yeah, so but that's realism, the academic theory, and then yeah, idealism is just it's kind of a fuzzier term that just means yeah, you know, some sort of optimism or working toward a better world, and yeah, I just it doesn't really that's not really a formal classification that people
Right. Yeah.
yeah
I sort of, if I were to class myself with those, I tend to fall on the idealism portion of that, though, which is cooperation. Let's sort of, you know, try to, instead of using force and it's all about our power is bigger than your power, let's come together to basically, in a weird way, I'm what I would be classed as a globalist in a lot of ways, because, and again, I wouldn't use that term because that's basically a pejorative term at this point, that where the right
yeah
throws at everybody. And there is some underlying, as far as I can tell, there seems to be an underlying anti-Semitic element to that too, or there can be
often yeah
certain, yeah.
yeah
But it's funny because I actually see a lot of the merits with idealism, as far as, the more interconnected you are. I tend to believe, or think at least, I don't like to use the word believe as much, but I think that the idea that if you're connected, economically, it does seem to relinquish the idea that you're going to go to war with one another, and that seems to be like an idealistic point of view. And I often hold that. What do you think about that? Though, are you sort of on that side, or is that naive, or what do you think?
I mean, if you're describing idealism as sort of the commitment to yeah, a global liberal international order or a globalist international order, which I actually don't shy from the word globalist. Like my
Right.
Substack is called Notes on Globalism, and I don't even say that tongue in cheek. Like I don't
Mm.
mind, but I actually like the fact that the word is so despised by the
Right. Yeah.
Trumpists and by the right-wing authoritarians in Europe and by the national conservatives, all these groups that they hate globalists. But I mean, I personally think that globalism is the only way the world can really be organized. I'm not under any illusions. I don't think, I mean, I think global governance has some very hard and fast limits on what it can accomplish. I mean, you just have to look at the dysfunctional nature of the UN to see that. I mean, you can just look at the single state veto on the UN Security Council and recognize that a world in which the United States is trying to reach consensus with China and Russia is probably a world where you're not going to have very effective global governance. And so I actually wrote a piece for Quillette a little while ago called Toward a New International Order or Toward a New Global Order, something like that. And I was basically arguing that we should revive the concept of the League of Democracies, which
Hmm.
was, I mean, this is a very old idea. It's an idea that was put forward by Kant, but it was sort of what underpinned the original League of Nations. But then many countries that weren't particularly democratic ended up joining, and then the United States didn't really take an active role, which kind of doomed the whole thing. But yeah, I do think that some attempt at global governance is very important, and the way in which it actually works in the real world is with the backing of military force. I mean, you can't have this is why
Hmm.
NATO is such an important institution. It's the most
Hmm.
successful military alliance in human history. I mean, we all take it for granted now that the idea of France and Germany going to war with one another is just inconceivable. But I mean, historically, it happened constantly. That's one of the greatest achievements in human history, and it requires, yeah, it requires this understanding that the security architecture in Europe is integrated, and that it's The NATO allies aren't going to fight wars with one another. They're actually going to defend one another. So that's a
Right.
form of it's idealistic, sure, and a lot of people would view a sentence that includes the words NATO and idealism together as absurd. But I don't think of it that way. I mean, I really do. And yeah, NATO it's supposed to be founded on democratic values. That's in the NATO charter.
Hmm.
And there are obvious exceptions to it. You know, NATO countries have gone to war. You know, just look at what happened in Cyprus between Greece and Turkey, for example. Just look at Turkey now. Turkey is not a democracy in the same way that the United States is. So
Hmm.
there are certainly problems with that. But yeah, I mean, the world's just a messy place, and NATO is a pretty good approximation of what sort of internationalism I think we should be going for.
What you're talking about right now reminds me, and whenever we talked last, I had asked you, did you ever read The Open Society and Its Enemies by Karl Popper? Because he's my, as I'm currently working on this work, a book about Popper and Darwin and mixing their ideas. So Popper has been an obsession with mine for many years now. And whenever you were speaking, you just sort of invoked it a bit there. And you had never read the book, is what you told me last time, but you sounded like a Popperian to me in how you speak about
Yeah, maybe.
politics, in the sense that when you use words like it's messy, that's basically saying, yes, it is messy. And Popper has this whole idea of historicism, which is the idea that a deterministic view of the world where things have to unfold, or people can basically prophesy the future with the unfolding. And you see that a lot with books like this right here, The Clash of Civilizations by Samuel Huntington, which I actually like this book a lot.
Mhm.
Mearsheimer puts this off a lot, where he makes these sort of, they're kind of prophecies. And we were talking about him a moment ago, where he's like, he makes all these predictions, and most of it just never comes true, because he doesn't account for the fact that you have within that, within the times that he's saying that uh, X is going to happen, there's going to be a whole bunch of mitigating factors in there. And again, like these types of thinking, this type of thinking is will harden people's worldviews and give them this really, as far as I can tell, like dogmatic ideology. Whereas, as you just said, things are messy, and we need to allow sort of an open mind here and deal with things as they come, rather than trying to direct, ourselves in a certain direction. And I find that a lot of these kind of like ideologues that, and again, they write interesting books, like Mearsheimer, whether you like him or not, he throws out theories and ideas, and we have to contend with those. Samuel Huntington, I like more. He throws out his theory in 1993 or whenever he wrote this. Um, and again, we have to contend with it. But it's just often the case that they never take into account these type of theorists, that you can't test these things. They're not falsifiable, because they're only, if it comes true, then sure. But sometimes astrologers are right, but that doesn't make
Mhm.
astrology, the idea of astrology, a something that actually works. It's just sort of a
Yeah.
guess. But my point being is that a lot of these people, they end up building these ideologies, and then we as liberals, you and myself, have to end up combating a lot of what the fallout from these ideologies are, because people in their camps harden. They'll either be like Chomsky and them with the hard left, anti-American style thing, and they never take into account, like, yes, America has flaws. We've done stuff in South America that's terrible. We've done this, we've done that, but nobody is perfect. There's not a place on this planet right now that is a true blue open society, like Popper talks about in The Open Society and Its Enemies. Open society is more, I look at it as more of a North Star that we want to be aiming towards, but we just don't know if we're ever going to get there. And we're never going to get there. And even if we got there, we wouldn't know if it was the case. Again, like in a Popperian form of view, you might land on the truth, but the thing is, you're never going to be able to prove it. So um, I tend to like things in this sort of open, or take things on in an open way, where it just it allows for us to handle things without authoritarianism, without in a basically like in an adult fashion, rather than what we're seeing now, which is the Trumpians of the world are predicting chaos and are prophesying chaos, and all of this kind of stuff. On that note, though, I just said all that about Popper. You wrote a piece recently on Popper. What were your thoughts on the Open Society and Its Enemies. As I said, you didn't read it before, but now you have read it, and I
Yeah,
know
yeah.
that you have some contentions with it, perhaps. But what are your ultimate thoughts on Popper's worldview as far as all this goes?
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot to unpack there. I will say just first, as kind of a throat clearing, yeah, Mearsheimer made some predictions at the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s about the shape of the world, the post-Cold War world, and the article was titled "Why We Will Soon Miss the Cold War." And his basic
Mm.
argument was that NATO would fall apart because it didn't have the animating, sort of galvanizing influence of the Soviet Union to fight against, and instead NATO expanded. So that was something he got exactly wrong. He thought there
Right.
would be massive nuclear proliferation. He thought Germany was going to bully its neighbors, and Germany was going to be so aggressive toward other smaller European states that Russia might have to step in and check German aggression. So it's pretty rich for Mearsheimer to make predictions about anything because his predictions in the past have been actually comically wrong, actually exactly wrong. Like it's hard to get it more wrong than he got it. So yeah, it's very funny when you hear Mearsheimer saying X, Y, and Z. Be very cautious because he tends to get things hilariously wrong. So
Right.
but Mearsheimer doesn't have like a teleology, it's like realists don't
Oh
have
yeah, yeah,
any,
yeah,
so
yeah.
they're certainly not historicists, but they do think that the world behaves in utterly predictable ways, like based on state behavior and the distribution of power in the state system. And I just think that's when you have a view that's that hardened and that immovable, you're going to encounter problems because you're going to wedge all of the data into your paradigm instead of interpreting what's
I
actually happening.
I don't want to derail your thought, but I like what you just did there because I made this claim that Mearsheimer is sort of like a historicist, and you actually made a slight distinction there and said he's not truly a historicist, but he's almost like you implied that he could be a and a historicist in an adjacent way. I think you're right to do that, and this is something that I want to point out to people. Anybody that reads Matt Johnson's work. You will notice this is why I like your work is because you will take an idea that's actually kind of complex, or it seems like two things that are sort of similar, and then you have to slice between what's not similar about them. You're very good at this. But anyways, continue. That's all
Oh,
I
well,
was going to say.
thanks. That's kind of you to
Yeah.
say. But yeah, I mean, in the Substack piece that you were talking about a second ago, I did have to make some finer distinctions than I actually originally planned to, just because some of the things Mearsheimer has said about NATO, for example, are more tolerant than what you would imagine. Just because he's gone to the mat on this idea that NATO is just 100% to blame for the invasion of Ukraine, which is
Right.
just ludicrous. I mean, it rids Putin of any agency, of any responsibility for his actions. He constantly says, "Yeah, NATO is the taproot of the problem." He loves the word taproot. It shows up constantly in his books. It's like he's getting down to the foundations of the argument. But anyway, yeah. So I did have to do that, but I do also recognize that the realists understand some things about the distribution of power, and like in Walt's book, The Hell of Good Intentions, he has to admit at one point that TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was ultimately negotiated under Obama, but it started before him, was a tremendous economic check on Chinese power. And that's like,
Mm.
but that's like a classic liberal hegemonic trade agreement. It's free trade, which nobody likes now. The left and the right both hate. I still love it, but hey,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
a dying breed, I guess.
Right.
But anyway, so they're willing to confront some facts that do disagree with their I guess general theory. Like it's sometimes the realists are unlike Chomsky, who's just exactly what he's going to say on literally every issue. He has not fundamentally updated his worldview since the mid 1960s. Like
Right.
Chomsky is just utterly predictable. So I mean, I'm sure Mearsheimer would happily admit like he got it wrong in the early 90s because you can't make any other you can't say that you were right that Germany was going to bully its neighbors and then you end up with Angela Merkel like you know
Mm.
but just to get to Popper because I think you asked about him like 10 minutes ago. Yeah, I did just read the Open Society and Its Enemies for the very first time. I looked into it because of our conversation, and
Mm.
Popper's always kind of been floating around in the background, and I've known a little bit about like just his emphasis on falsifiability and his scientific contributions, but I just didn't look into his political work all in great depth. So yeah, around Christmas time, I just read the whole book, and I wrote
Right.
this monster essay for Quillette about it, and I found Popper frustrating. I found him very clarifying, and I found the work itself very important. In many ways, he wrote it during World War II. So he started writing it right after the Anschluss, when Hitler just absorbed Austria, and he's Austrian, so it has a pessimistic tone to it, you know. But
Yeah, yeah.
I just found that what was so powerful about it was his critique of historicism was largely correct, as far as I could tell. The idea that you can actually identify the mechanics and the gears of history, as Marxists think you can do, or as, you know, many theocrats think you can do, like that, it's
Mm,
very dangerous because it leads you to treat human beings like raw material. It leads
mm,
you to treat people not as ends in themselves, as Kant would have us do, but as means to ends. And I thought his challenge of that was extremely powerful. There were things that I thought were just unfair in the book. He was too hard on Hegel, I thought.
right.
He and
Yeah.
there was one particular moment where he said Hegel was opposed to the French Revolution, and that's just not true. I mean, in my reading of Hegel, he saw the French Revolution as sort of like the embodiment of values that sorry, the dog's going crazy. The embodiment of like the world historical process.
Right.
So I just thought, like, we just got that one wrong, you know. And so
Yeah.
that's the sort. And he was just like, he was so critical of Plato. Like I've never, I
Oh
didn't even know it
yeah.
was possible to be this critical of Plato. I mean, it was just
He
I
does.
thought it
He
was
does. He claims in there though. He's like, he goes, I don't want to build up somebody who is already probably the greatest. You know, he basically says he's like the greatest philosopher of all time. He's like, I just want to destroy what I think of as. He uses the term like, what does he say? I want to destroy what I think of as mischievous in his
yeah,
work.
yeah. No, it's
And
funny. He
but
does have a
but
lot of those
the,
disclaimers. They're very funny. Where
yeah,
like, just
but
so
he
you
comes.
know, I'm coming at
Yeah,
Plato hard.
but he does come off as like he actually even says he's like he goes, this whole book is going to be me talking about or criticizing some of the greatest minds in history. Forewarning, disclaimer, and here we go. And he starts
Yeah,
laying it out. But you actually get if you're not because of reading that book, and I hate to I don't want to just derail us here, but this is just so fascinating. If you read that book, it does make you think like, my God, he hated uh, Plato. He couldn't stand Aristotle. He definitely couldn't stand Hegel. He was right there with Arthur Schopenhauer, who thought Hegel was a complete stupid person. I mean, he
yeah.
literally was like, I,
And he cites Schopenhauer.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And
And
Schopenhauer, by the way, knows how to like he knows how to talk shit.
oh, dude, he was like
Yeah,
one of the lines that Schopenhauer wrote about Hegel was just like Hegel, or excuse me, Popper quotes it in the book, and I forget. It's like this massive, long, 17th or excuse me, 19th century line, or and it's just, oh man, it's just like eviscerating on Hegel. But yeah. Anyways, so you were saying though, it's like you had to. There were some frustrating parts about the book. What was it the ultimate thing that frustrated you about the Open Society? Was it the writing itself? Was it other than the fact that
no,
he got some things wrong and as far as
it
Hegel
was
goes?
no, it was and I actually thought that writing wasn't that bad. I had read somewhere that it was inaccessible, but I didn't find it all that difficult to take. And I
Hmm.
and this is and I've certainly encountered very Hegel is inaccessible. Like
Oh
Hegel is
yeah.
extremely hard to read. But anyway, I thought it was yeah, I thought it was perfectly clear what his point was. Oh, I did find that he went on very long tangents that were probably unnecessary. Just about
Hmm.
epistemology and about other
Like,
things. I mean, the book could have been 200 pages shorter.
oh
Um,
yeah.
but no, what I should get to what I really valued about it, which is this: that he was calling for a more just a like what he calls piecemeal social engineering. It's
Right.
it's a much
Yeah.
more modest approach to governance, and it was actually very in line with his views about epistemology more broadly and falsifiability, because he basically says like no democratic society should expect its rulers to be all that benign. I mean, you'll get some real stinkers in there. You'll get some really dangerous people. You'll get anti-democratic people even will be elected, and
Right.
this is obviously relevant to our time. But the thing you have to keep in mind and you have to focus on all the time is the value of liberal democracy itself. Like
Mm,
these,
yeah.
this is the playing field that has to be maintained. If you can't maintain the playing field, then it doesn't matter what game you're playing on that field. It doesn't matter what policies you pass. Like it's everything will crumble. And I just thought that was like it couldn't be more timely. It couldn't be more relevant.
He says
And
in
this was
the
somebody who, yeah, was living through World War II and
oh
witnessed
yeah.
the greatest
He
collapse you can imagine. So
absolutely. He says that in the book he changes the question, the age old question, who should rule? He thinks that the question should be, how do we make it where our institutions allow for or don't allow for a ruler to destroy everything.
Exactly.
Basically,
Yeah.
he strengthening institutions is his whole end game. And as far as like, he even talks about the idea of he says, I realize that the term social engineering has been pilloried throughout the time, and people even nowadays, the moment they hear that, the Alex Jonesians of the world will be like, social engineering. But I'm like, folks, we're getting social engineering is just the nature of how things work. And Popper is simply saying that we want to do this very piecemeal, in the sense that institutions actually are the founding fathers or framers of the Constitution. They had this very much in play whenever they were making that thing. We see this nowadays. Like, that's why presidents have to constantly use executive orders, because they realize, they're like, damn it, I can't just, the Congress can't legislate because it takes too long. You know what I mean? It's like, so then you have this problem now with executive orders, but that's actually kind of against what Popper was talking about, because now these presidents are able to, and this is liberals as well, are able to change things at a faster rate, and it could end up destroying certain things in a potentially. I mean, it's not guaranteed. It could help things, but everything in like you said in the book was all about piecemeal social engineering, and it's not about who is ruling, because there's always going to be people that are terrible. We have Trump right now, who I would argue, just looking at American history, I actually think he's maybe certainly the most vapid person we've ever had in office. Almost uninteresting in every level, except for the fact that he's so consequential. This is what's so strange about Trump. But he might be the worst president I've ever seen, or
I mean,
read about,
at this point,
And it sounds so hyperbolic to say that, but I'm like, James Buchanan, I mean, he's that level, bad. I mean, it's just very, and my fear is that he's opening the door for something even worse. Say, for instance, his son, or even Vance, he's coming off now as a lunatic whenever he talks about the international order. On that note, what were your thoughts, moving away from Popper? What were your thoughts on the meeting between Vance and Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky?
Oh, I mean, I just, like so many Americans, I found it harrowing. I found it disgusting, despicable, ridiculous. I mean, when you have a meeting like that, and the first thing you're hearing is from Peskov, straight out of the Kremlin, that the United States and Russia are now aligned. There's
Right.
fundamental alignment and visions. People forget, actually, at the very beginning of the Ukraine war, Lavrov said at one point, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, said that this war has nothing to do with Ukraine, which is a funny thing to say. He said it had everything to do with the world order. And Putin has long believed that Ukraine is this vessel through which NATO is attempting to undermine Russia. He's always viewed Ukraine as a completely illegitimate state entity. He doesn't believe that it actually is a state. So to watch, I watched all the footage when the invasion first happened. I was as horrified as anyone else. I mean, the footage of, have you ever seen 21 Days in Mariupol? It's an extremely powerful documentary from the early days of the war.
Oh man, amazing, incredible. Yeah, PBS put it out. Yeah,
one of the most courageous pieces of filmmaking I've ever seen.
Me
But
too.
yeah, I mean, I just remember seeing footage of, a tank rolling down the street and directing its barrel at people who I think they were in a hospital in Mariupol, and just saying that image right there looks exactly like World War II. Exactly.
Right.
And so to have a president who blames the victims, who blames Zelensky, who says Zelensky is a dictator, who says that the war was caused by NATO, that the Ukrainians never should have started it, that Putin is this peacemaker, and that Zelensky's the one gambling with World War III. You don't have any cards right now. You're gambling with World War III. It was truly one of the most repugnant things I've ever witnessed. It made me ashamed to be an American, and there aren't many moments in life when I can say that, but I did in that moment feel that.
I was on vacation whenever that happened. I think that, and I kind of stayed away from the news. I opened the news and I see that footage. It's like 2 minutes of footage, and I couldn't believe. I literally, it's one of those moments where my jaw dropped. It was like, I could not believe that interaction, and how, I mean, they were treating this man. I think they even like there was a moment where I think Trump was like maybe not in the video, but it was certainly reported that he was like, "Thanks for dressing up," and he was just already just coming out. I'm like, what about Musk, who walks into this White House with his child? Which I mean, I love children are fine and all, but it's sort of like I'm so powerful, I can just allow my kids to come into the Oval Office. I wear a T-shirt. I mean, what are you guys gonna do? I mean, come on. So, like, for them to go after a guy who's in the middle of an existential war and treat him this way, I mean, I was just and with one of our biggest foes. I mean, the thing about this that I all I could think was while I was watching, I'll say a few things. I'll have you react to it. Is that uh, recently I read a book. Actually, this past week I read a book. I don't know if you've heard of it. Just came out called Interference: the inside story of Trump, Russia, and the Mueller investigation. It's by Aaron Zebley, James Quarles, and Andrew Goldstein. And actually, Robert Mueller introduces the book, which I thought was interesting because you never hear him speak. And actually, for a good reason. I mean, he just likes to stay respectable and all this kind of stuff. But anyways, I'm reading this book, and then I've also read the January 6th report. I watched most of all those, the stuff that was going on in Congress whenever they put that forth. And I'm sitting here thinking that Russia literally tried to, for years, they continuously tried to denigrate democracy. They interfered in the 2016 election, full stop. I mean, it's absolutely true that they did this. They wanted Trump, full stop, to win. And it's obvious to me that there was no collusion, and I'll make that distinction. But there certainly was. It was Trump never said anything bad about Putin or anything throughout this whole time, and like you have Putin that literally wants America to fail. This is a guy that literally wants us to fail, and they want to be the new hegemonic power on the world stage. And yet we are capitulating. We have so much evidence of this. It's everywhere. And we're capitulating to this madman. I just don't understand what's going on with conservatives across the board. What do you make of what's going on with people like Vance, with people like Trump, with people like Tucker Carlson, with basically conservatives across the board? Do you think it's just a love of strongmen, or do you think it's like a hate of democracy, or what do you think it is?
I think it varies depending on which particular figure you're talking about. But in Trump's case, I've been sort of developing a theory that the reason why he is so hostile to not just Ukraine, but NATO and the entire, post-war security architecture in the world is because he wants there to be no constraints on his freedom of action. I mean, he thinks because he's so arrogant and so incredibly stupid and ahistorical, and he has absolutely no guardrails now. There's nobody in the room to tell him, Mr. President, this is actually not workable, or you're chasing a phantom here, which there were those people the first time around. Like he thinks he can organize a summit with Putin and Xi Jinping and cut all of the military budgets, the Chinese, Russian, and American military budgets in half. He just thinks he has that power. This is something he wants to do now. That's on his docket. He said he could end the Ukraine war in 24 hours. He thinks he can turn Gaza into a luxury, resort. I mean, the man is a cretin. He's a child. And it's genuinely pathetic to watch him scramble around because now look at what Russia is doing. It's very obvious. Like Putin agrees to this energy infrastructure ceasefire. I mean, Trump had said that it was energy and infrastructure, but then Putin said it was just energy infrastructure. That's a huge difference. I mean, energy infrastructure is one thing. Energy and infrastructure, well, that's rail lines, that's roads, that's plumbing, that's everything. So it's just typical. But anyway, so he's going to give Trump as much as he can reasonably while just keeping the war going, because Putin recognizes that what he has in Trump is an American president and the most powerful leader of the free world who really does want to destroy the liberal international order. This is something Putin has spent decades trying to do. It's something Russian intellectuals, imperialist intellectuals like Dugin have spent even longer trying to do.
Yeah.
And Trump is handing it to them on a silver platter. So, but they can't just stop the war. Putin's not going to stop the war. Putin is not going to be happy with a few territories in eastern Ukraine. This is not the end for him. The end for him is a hollowed out state. It's a state that can't run its own affairs. It's a state that's essentially a vassal of Russia. That has always been the
Mm,
point. It's always been the goal, and he won't stop until he gets that. So
mm,
that's and Trump does not understand that. Trump thinks he's desperate to get out. All he wants is to get out. And the reason Trump's doing what he's doing is because he promised he could. He said he would do it on the
mm.
campaign trail. He doesn't like the war. He doesn't like the threat of nuclear war. Trump will sometimes say, yeah, nuclear war is the gravest existential threat we face. But then he does things like what I mean, I think personally that we will pull out of NATO. I think Trump will try to do it. So this is a
Mm.
prediction. You can, we can return to this in a couple of years. He has no reason not to. There's no reason why he thinks the United States should come to the aid of a tiny Baltic republic that gets invaded by Putin. He wouldn't do it. We already know he
Mm.
wouldn't do it. There's a 0% chance he would do it. Just as there's a 0% chance if there's a blockade on Taiwan, Trump is not calling Xi Jinping's bluff. He's probably going to call him up and be like, hey, can we share some of the semiconductor profits? And this
Mm.
is how he functions. So yeah, he just wants to minimize constraints. And then somebody like Carlson, yeah, I think he just genuinely, I think he hates Western liberal democracy. I think he hates it. He
Right.
thinks it culminated in wokeness. This is why he's completely attracted to just the sort of cultural elements of Putinism. And this is
Right.
something that's captured a lot of the right. They all think it's super original and interesting. It's actually just laughable. Like it's exactly what the Romantic movement was after the Enlightenment. Like it's just the return to anti-Enlightenment values. We have to fight this fucking battle over and
Right.
over and over again. Sorry for the language. I don't know if this is
Oh
offending your
no, it's
kid,
okay.
but
Oh
yeah.
no, it's okay. No,
Anyway,
the
yeah.
and do you think that then you have slightly still sticking with this whole our talk about the liberal international order, but I sort of want to bring in this guy. This might not even be worth talking about, but I'll just mention him to you. The old Mencius Moldbug, Curtis Yarvin, this writer. He's such a goofball, but he's taken seriously by people like Vance, and he has this whole idea. He's anti-democratic. I mean, that's his whole point. Is like he wants essentially a government run like a corporation, or like the president should be like a CEO slash king. And people on the right now, for some reason, take this seriously, including up to and including the current vice president. What do you make of? Have you read any of Yarvin's stuff? I read like
I
somewhere in like 2015, I think I did, but
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
My familiarity with him is pretty limited. I listened to half read his interview with the New York Times recently.
I did too. Yeah, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, and I listened to an episode of a podcast called Decoding the Gurus where they quoted him a lot, and they
Yeah,
basically went through like one of his interviews, and yeah, I just find him. I mean, I completely agree with their conclusion. He's a nullity, a complete non-entity. He doesn't talk about how this can be proceduralized. He doesn't talk about how I mean the idea of returning the anti-monarchist United States, which was founded on opposition to the British monarchy. I mean, Trump. Trump is obviously interested in this unitary executive theory. He's obviously going to push things as far as he can. He's already defined court orders. He's an authoritarian through and through. But if you just
Mm.
straight up went with the project of a national CEO or a national monarch, I mean, it would obviously fail. Like Americans wouldn't support it. Trump's approvals are already going down fast. Elon Musk's are underwater pretty significantly. You
Right.
do have to still occupy the real world. There are a lot of MAGA people, farmers, for example, who had grants and deals with the government that have just been put on hold, have been iced, or have been completely destroyed. I
Right.
don't know that people are loving the ASMR videos of people getting loaded onto C-130s and chains. I think
That's
they're
insane.
overstepping here. Like this is to me, this has got to be the greatest like mismatch between a popular mandate and the behavior of the government that got that mandate in history. Like they're acting
Mm.
like they won with Saddam Hussein levels of support.
Mm.
They're acting like they won with, I mean, which is obviously it was fake support in Iraq,
Right.
but
Right.
like
Yeah.
95% of the vote, the American people have given us this mandate. And I
It's
gotta, I'm making myself a hostage to fortune, I know, but I don't see the midterms going well for them at this stage because
I think that, yeah, I mean, with what he's doing with the thing is like this idea. But actually, I'm going to get on the tariffs, and before I leave that, I think that I'm going to come back to tariffs, but which we'll talk about what I think is going to happen with the Trump midterms and whatever it could lead into what's going to happen there. But this Curtis Yarvin fellow and people like him, there's something about people like this that will pop up every now and again. To an extent, somebody like Jordan Peterson even fits this bill, which I mean, Jordan Peterson has moments where he actually I mean, like 5% will make sense, but these people like this will take arcane ideas and then they'll kind of mash them with other arcane ideas, and then people that are not used to the intellectual realm or the intellectual world, that don't read a lot, I'm I'm not I have no money myself. I'm like a low bottom feeder, but I just happen to like to read and stuff like that. But when you have these people come along and they'll write something that's super arcane, and I think it just fascinates people that aren't heavy readers and all, to the degree they're like, that's a smart guy right there, we need to be listening to him, folks. And it's like, I'm
Yeah.
like, and then people like, I just look at it and I'm like, this guy is clearly a charlatan. He's taking arcane ideas, mixing them together into something that's really not, as you said a moment ago, it's not really even something you could materialize or you could mechanize, and it's just kind of crazy sounding. But people that aren't used to these ideas think he's really come on to something here, folks. And this guy has clear, and then it has what happens is somebody like this will be listened to, and then all of a sudden you have views on YouTube that'll go from like 30,000. People are like, oh, somebody's listening to them. Then it's like gravity. And then you have that'll turn into 300,000. Now you got really a followership. Then it turns into 1 million. And it's like a Russell Brand style thing where you have it's just this idea of like people are listening just because people are listening at this point. And then people have to, then we people that are trying to be serious in this world are, to a large degree are having to take this seriously. And I'm like, this is not even something we should be talking about. It's this, I mean, these ideas are so stupid. I mean, really, it's just like, but people think that we need to be like really analyzing it. And like the fact that the New York Times had to sit down with this guy, it just boggles my mind. I mean, it's because he's become consequential. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mentioned Alexander Dugin a second ago, the Russian philosopher. I just read a great New Yorker piece about him. It broke down just sort of his career arc. He kind of worked with the communists briefly in the 90s because they wanted to restore some of the Soviet Union, and he's always been this like imperialist, and he's just like he has an interesting story arc, but he's obviously, despite the insane, truly insane things he says. I mean, he's long argued that Ukraine isn't a real state. There needs to be this Eurasian empire to counter the decadence of the West. All the stuff that you can see just get implanted in Putin's speeches and his essays. But yeah, the guy's he's a lunatic, but he's extremely influential, obviously.
Right.
When his daughter was killed in August 2022, probably by Ukrainian agents. I think it was supposed to be a Russian paramilitary group. Like that's what claimed credit for it. But I think most Western intelligence agencies think it was probably Ukraine, and they're probably trying to kill him. But like when her funeral was held, I mean, everybody was there. Like the most influential people in Russia, the most influential members of the oligarchy. And one guy gave a speech, some Russian billionaire, and he said there's going to be a street in Kyiv named after her, when we take over all of Ukraine. So it's like, yeah, these people are gross. They have silly ideas, but they are taken seriously. And you look at somebody like Curtis Yarvin, he probably sounds like Socrates compared to Trump. So it's not like
right, yeah.
It's not a prerequisite. You don't need to be articulate. You don't need to have a particularly like coherent or interesting worldview to have a lot of power in the United States, unfortunately.
There's people that the people that I actually I look at and I take seriously. It sucks because most people, since we're living this YouTube world and news and all this kind of declined and all this kind of stuff, people just want to hear these crazy ideas because they just find them fascinating. But I'm like, it's sad because I'm like, yeah, but these people aren't serious people. They're like, if you look at, and you strike me as this too. I still like looking at old magazines like Harper's and stuff like that. I live in this old world where I subscribed to Harper's for a while there, like the New Yorker, for instance. I was a big.
I wrote a book about Hitchens. I mean, you got to read some Harper's.
Yeah. Oh, hold on a second. I lost my volume. Hold on one second.
No problem.
Okay, I'm back. Yeah, you wrote a book about Hitchens, though.
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time reading old Harper's issues, The Nation.
Right, yeah. Nation, New Republic. He was in that world, and I love that world. And it's just like I take those types of ideas seriously, but now you have all these YouTubers. That's why I mean, I even fear being a person that does podcasts because they're just, I don't take many podcasts seriously, even
Well,
though I
there's
do
a
one.
I had this moment recently where so there's some guy who was I think the CEO of the Daily Wire organization or like the president.
Oh yeah. Mm.
And he was just booted out for some reason. Like he's just going to be have some advisory role going forward. And so I started reading a little bit about the Daily Wire. The Bulwark had an article about this. And then I was reading about some like up and coming influencers. I mean, people with like millions of followers on YouTube, you know, thousands of times more influence than I could ever dream of having. And I just
Mm.
like yeah, there was one I can't even remember her name, but she like posted this big like I'm back video because she was at the Daily Wire and then she like set out on her own. And
Oh
this
yeah,
is
yeah.
a something that happens. I mean, Candace
Right.
Owens did the same thing and she became
Right.
even more influential despite her putrid anti-Semitism and despite
Oh
just
yeah.
the sheer lunacy and stupidity of what she's been saying for many years. I mean, I actually really couldn't stand Candace Owens long before it was cool. I mean, I was writing
Right.
articles about how she was a nightmare in like 2018 just for the record,
Mm.
you know. I mean, this is when she was calling for journalists to be imprisoned. I'll never forget that one. And
Yeah.
this is the exact same time, by the way, when people like Douglas Murray and Christina Hoff Sommers were saying that she's just this whip smart young black girl saying that the emperor has no clothes and she's just like she's the woke
Right.
left's worst nightmare, you know. And I was just like, you guys are just this is dense. Like, I mean,
Oh
we can't
man.
just this is classic. This is classic. Like the free press, for example, they're so anti-woke that they can't just go at Trump guns blazing, you know? Like
Right.
there always has to be this disclaimer. It always has, yeah, I mean, Trump, yeah, he's authoritarian, sure. He's trying to overthrow the Constitution, but you know, trans sports, trans kids in sports, like it's just
Oh
what are
man.
we doing here? Like this is I mean, we're facing a real civilizational challenge and we're still bogged down in the culture wars. Like, I mean, if you I'm not sure if you read the Hitchens book, but I have a whole chapter on identity politics, and the
Oh yeah, I
chapter is
read it.
titled
Mhm.
Sinister Bullshit. That's the title of the chapter.
Yeah.
I'm really not a fan of identity politics, never have been. But
Yeah.
we reached peak woke years ago. This
Right.
thing has been on a downtrend for a long time.
Hmm.
Nobody in the Democratic Party is going to introduce abolish the police again. You know, you're probably not going to see articles in NPR about how rioting is good
Right.
or looting is good. Like they are flogging the corpse of this thing. And while
Mm.
the Trump administration is obviously just exploiting it, I mean, he's like, it's just anyone, if you just have a black pilot now, they're like, oh, well, the plane's going to crash. Like,
Right.
this is
Yeah.
horrible. It's a
Yeah. Yeah.
perfect inversion of what was happening before. So,
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, if anything's ever going to make me woke, it's this.
Yeah.
Like,
It's one of yeah, it's
yeah.
one of those things where you have people that actually are good writers and all, and you mentioned the free press. It's like that I'm just like, why are they so silent? They were going every ham about the woke stuff. And by the way, these aren't even people that are in power. Most of the woke stuff was coming from sort of more cultural. I mean, it was in like elite institutions and all, but even there, like if you just went to a college on a regular day, you wouldn't notice a whole bunch of woke stuff going on.
Yeah, yeah,
But
right.
if you watch
Yeah.
if people that watch libs of TikTok every second of the day, their world is so is they literally think that there's a transgender book reading on every corner, and I'm just like, dude, that is not that it just doesn't exist. I mean, and even if it did, we do live in a free society, so it can happen, whatever. But I'm just it was like as you said, they take it and they demagogue and they use fear and prejudice and all this kind of stuff. It's classic demagogic point of view, and it's just very frustrating. And as you said, they are beating a dead horse now because I'm like, what? Going back to the free press. What is going on over at the free press? I actually Barry Weiss I like, but I had to always talk to my wife. She'll hear me say, "What is?" I'm always like, "What is going on with Barry Weiss's? Why aren't they just hitting this hard? They're not hitting it hard. They should be going full swing into." You have Neil Ferguson, for instance. He writes now for the Free Press. You wrote an article about him, and he the other day whenever he was on Sam Harris's podcast, I couldn't even hardly listen to that. He starts off the podcast and he says, "We are living in 1933," and then I'm like, "Oh, this is going to be an interesting critique." So he's going to sort of make this, but then it was
He's a Trump
controversial.
supporter.
It was a controversial in the sense that he goes not in the sense that Trump is like Hitler, but in the sense that Trump is like FDR. And then he goes on this whole rant about, I'm like, why would you choose this as your clearly this was like this
Because he likes to
weird
be a contrarian. It's just Ferguson is so frustrating. Yeah, I mean, in that conversation, I mean, yeah, he after January 6th, he had the proper reaction where he said, "This is an authoritarian demagogue who should never be let near power again." And now he says, I was wrong about that. I mean, it's just, of course you say that now, Neil. And every prediction you've made about how Trump would behave has been 100% wrong. He thought Trump
Right.
was going to be some tough-minded guy who's like going to shock everybody on Ukraine. He's going to turn out to be Churchill on Ukraine. No, he
Right.
was a joke. He gave the whole farm away immediately, like we all knew he would. Another thing, in this interview in the Times, Neil Ferguson said he thought that Trump, like the all the dynamism was on the right, the economic dynamism. Like you're just going to get stagnation, and you're just going to get terrible industrial policy with Biden, which he compared to the dying Soviet Union, which is one of the things I took issue with in the article you mentioned a second ago.
Right.
But anyway, yeah, we're gonna get all this economic dynamism from Trump, and now he's writing articles in the Free Press about what we really got was this reactionary economic policy that's trying to drag us back to mercantilism and to protectionism, and there's so many people like me who have followed Neil for years, and we're
Right.
like, he was screaming tariffs at the top of his lungs every day for the campaign. He says it's the most beautiful word in the English language, more beautiful than love.
I'm tariff
Tariffs,
man. Yeah,
tariffs.
tariff.
He's the tariff man. And then he
Yeah.
gets into office and he imposes tariffs. And Neil Ferguson runs around with his head chopped off and says, "What? What? We weren't expecting this." I mean, Neil, what are
Yeah.
you doing? Like, it's
Right.
so frustrating that these people they just thought that they could mind read Trump.
I
And
know.
now it just turns out, well, you're not a great psychoanalyst. You know,
Right.
maybe you should stick to writing history and not trying to psychoanalyze presidential candidates, because you're really, really wrong and you're really bad at it.
Right.
Ugh,
Yes.
sorry for the
And
rant, but yeah, I find
oh
Neil
no.
extremely frustrating.
Oh, he's super frustrating because I'm like, why is he? Again, I read his book. The only book I've actually ever read of Neil's. I know he does history, did like Kissinger, Ascent of Money, all that stuff. But I read one of his more recent books, and actually it was kind of degrading on Trump in a way. It was called Doom, I think was what it was called. I read that book, and but even there, I mean, it's like I was like, why is he holding? Why are people so careful? I'm like, it's not. Whenever AOC or somebody like that, these hard leftists criticize Trump in a crazy way, where they're like, he's a Hitlerian fascist, blah blah blah. I'm like, okay, but like when you have serious-minded people that say, uh, I think that they're trying hard not to sound like the AOCs of the world. But I'm like, yeah, don't try too hard though, because I mean, we are dealing with somebody who is actually dangerous to the liberal international order. He's actually dangerous to democracy. He has people around him that are floating the idea of a third or demolishing the presidential, the 4 years per presidency. And he, of course, takes that sort of seriously.
Oh, he does.
And
No, he does say. I think we need to just get away from the idea that this is shit posting. It's not shit posting. It's
right.
not
Yeah.
shit posting. I mean,
Yeah.
this is something he's done from the very beginning when he lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton. I mean,
Mm.
he established the voter fraud commission. I actually happened to be working at a newspaper in Kansas, and Chris
Mm.
Kobach was our Secretary of State, and he headed up Trump's farcical voter fraud
Mm.
commission. And Chris Kobach, over his long career of busting fraudulent voters, I think he caught about a dozen. So,
Yeah.
that's great. That was a great use of taxpayer dollars there in Kansas. But then, yeah, I mean, Trump, of course, he said, I think they probably stole just about 3 million votes, because Trump lost by just about 3 million votes. So but this like, but then it was like, oh, it's this oddity, Trump he likes to win, and he's mad about not getting the popular vote, and it's Trump, don't take him seriously. Well, then he tried to overthrow an election, and then there was a gallows in front of the Capitol, and people were shouting, "Hang Mike Pence." And
Mm.
like, we needed to take it seriously the first time. This third term talk is absolutely it's serious business. I mean, Lindsey
Right.
Graham will post out like, "Oh, hey, Trump 2028," as if it's just this funny thing. It's Lindsey Graham being hip.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
And
it's just Graham's also the guy who went up on the floor of the Senate, after Trump tried to overthrow democracy, and said, "That's it, I'm done, I'm out, I'm done, I'm not doing this anymore." And then literally, like, within an hour, he was on the phone with Trump talking about his political future. This is like the
Right.
most vacuous human being in history. So anyway, yeah, I think we should take the third term stuff seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, man, I want to get to tariffs here, but like before I leave, again, talking about sort of the more global aspect of what Trump is up to, and also Elon Musk, who I'm going to mention here. Musk recently called the Democratic Senator Mark Kelly. He's the senator of Arizona. He said that he was. What did he say about?
Traitor.
He's a traitor because he visited Ukraine and basically showed support to a country that's fighting an actual dictator tyrant. And what did you make of that? What do you make of Musk's calling him a traitor? The guy served in the military for 25 years. His
I'm
brother's an
flabbergasted by
astronaut.
thinking
Yeah.
this is the sort of thing that makes me think the midterms are going to be bloody for the Republicans. Musk is just a he is. There's no way this plays well. I just don't think that selling Teslas on the front lawn of the White House plays well. I do not think calling an American hero, like a genuine, classic, square-jawed American hero,
Right.
a traitor from Elon Musk of all people. I
Yeah.
mean, it's absolutely, it boggles the mind. Like how this doesn't just, but then again, we have a president who has said the horribly disobliging things about the military and who said that, I like people who weren't captured, in reference to John McCain, another American hero. So yeah, obviously the GOP has taken leave of its senses and its ethical compass on all of these issues. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, I saw that, and that was like, he wasn't even saying Doge is like a horrible thing, or he wasn't saying that Donald Trump is a fascist. He didn't post something that was even like politically
Right.
valenced. He just went and visited Ukraine. That's it. And then
Crazy.
yeah, Musk just hops on X and calls him a traitor. Like, I mean, this is just like that would be the first thing I would ask Musk, if I was interviewing him. Like, why did you call this man a traitor? And I would love to hear him like just stumble through some completely like incoherent and like, because the man can't speak. Musk cannot speak. Is his
Yeah.
brain still working? I mean, it's
It's
unbelievable. Like,
Oh no, it's very strange. He speaks in
God.
like, yeah, and then he called Radislaw Sikorsky, which is the husband of Anne Applebaum, who is a famous writer she's anti-authoritarian.
Brilliant writer, brilliant historian.
Yeah, Pulitzer Prize winner for Gulag. I read her book Red Famine not too long ago, which is Stalin's subtitle Stalin's War on Ukraine. And he calls this guy, her husband, who is a Polish member of Foreign Affairs, a small man. And again, it was wasn't it in relation to
Had to do with Starlink.
Yeah,
He's just
Starlink. Yeah,
he was
helping
basically. I mean, it
Ukraine.
was Sikorsky. Yeah, he's the Polish foreign minister, and he was just saying like, we actually paid for Starlink already. Like, I don't know what you're, we're not worried about you shutting off something that we've already paid for. And it was just like, and then yeah, he said like, be quiet, small man, or something like that. And it's just like, how does anybody like this? And it's the way I'm glad that Musk came up here, because the way he goes about things, if he just stuck to the idiotic message of Doge, like we're just saving money and rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse, which is a laugh. It's a laugh coming from an administration that wants to cut trillions of dollars in taxes over the next few years for the mega wealthy. Like,
Right.
please stop pretending like you're trying to save our country money. Please stop acting like you're deficit hawks. This is a complete joke. It's actually been a joke forever. The right has never been deficit hawks. The only balanced budget we've had in the post Cold War era was Bill Clinton. I mean,
Clinton, yeah.
it's just total joke. But anyway, like saying we're feeding USAID into the wood chipper, that sort of thing. Like I just think about the people who are in the middle of HIV trials in sub-Saharan Africa and the amount of devastation this is going to cause. I mean, like ending funding for PEPFAR, and then Rubio said, well, you actually want PEPFAR to still be funded, but then he like couldn't get that done, and it doesn't really matter because like all the procedures for getting the money to people are getting like clogged up. It's the whole thing is a complete like a showcase of incompetence. But it's the
Right.
way he talks about this stuff. It's calling a true American patriot a traitor, saying they're feeding it into the wood chipper. Like he knows he can do all this horrible stuff, even if it's illegal, because Trump's just going to issue blanket pardons for everybody. But I just think that the American people don't like it. I actually happen to know somebody who's a very serious Trump supporter, and he doesn't like Musk. He can't stand him. Can't stand him. Says, why do I have to hear about this guy all the time? Why is he conducting policy for the United States? Why did he just get a briefing on our war strategy with China?
With China, yeah.
Why?
And
Excuse me?
yeah, I'm sort of wondering because I know Steve Bannon, who I don't care for at all. I mean, the Bannons of the world can't stand Musk either. So I'm sort of curious as to how the populist right is going to do with the techno bro right. It's a weird amalgam that's going on.
Yeah, there's tensions
There.
within the movement.
Right. Okay, tariffs. I was watching an old William F. Buckley firing line. I love William F. Buckley, even though he's a conservative. I mean, it's so funny because I have so many disagreements with Buckley, but I look to his conservatism back in the day, and more so as he got older, as something sort of. I tended to just like how he operated. And
Well, he
but
actually
he
read a book, you know.
yeah, exactly, and he
I
was
mean,
very
there's more than you can
serious.
say for like it's just you just look at like the Silicon Valley like Trump bros now. These guys are so unbelievably. I mean, they're good at business. Like, fine, you probably don't become a billionaire by accident. You know, I'm not. I think it's kind of cope when people say these people are all actually stupid. I don't think they're actually stupid, but they say incredibly stupid things.
Oh
Like
yeah,
I mean, David Sachs recently said like, oh, you know, a nice model for the United States and for the West and Ukraine would be Korea. I would have to say. And like
yeah,
what
yeah.
okay, so okay, well then we can put, you know, tens of thousands of US troops in Ukraine to guard the line that you established there for the next how many years, you know, like three-quarters of a
It,
century.
it's
You know, it's just like how you don't know what you're talking about. Stop. Like, this is a
right.
guy who was saying, I'm sorry, just one quick thing on the rant. Like,
Yeah.
he said after there was a big terrorist attack in Moscow, which Islamic State took credit for.
Hmm.
He immediately said this is probably Ukraine. You know, we need to watch out for the Ukrainians here. And then he was posting like Kremlin propaganda. The Kremlin's claim that it was Ukraine as some kind of evidence. Like, when people called him on it, and they were like, "No, it's the Islamic State, and this doesn't look like it was Ukraine." He was like, "Well, here, the Kremlin says that
Right,
it was
right.
Ukraine." I'm just like, what are you? You're really pretending like you're some geopolitical analyst? Like, dude, you're a joke. Like,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sorry.
Did David Saxa, what is his connection to, because I know he's taken seriously. This is another one of these guys that we would think of as a joke that's actually taken seriously by the right. What is his connection to Trump? I hate to say it, but I'm somewhat ignorant on it. Is
He's the
he?
AR. He's the AI czar, right?
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Or
Man. Yeah.
sometimes here he's the crypto czar, but I think he's the AI czar.
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
basically like the tech czar. Yeah.
And again, Trump was anti-crypto no more than, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago. Now he's like, he was like, it's a scam, it's a complete scam. Now he's like
Well, he was
completely on
anti
board.
TikTok right up until the moment he was very pro TikTok because a
Right.
very rich TikTok investor had a chat with him. That's not suspicious at all. There's nothing
Right.
suspicious about that, you know?
Yeah. Oh, so back to Buckley. That whenever I mentioned him, that I watched an old firing line, which was called. It's on YouTube. It's just called Tariffs. And the old school Buckleys of the world, the old liberal, or excuse me, conservative movement was so anti-tariff, and Buckley was a full-on free trader, Milton Friedman style, freaking to the core. And I can imagine. I wonder what Buckley would say. I often think this about. I think the same thing about Hitchens. What would Hitchens say in this moment? What would Buckley say in this moment? All these great thinkers of the recent past. What would Buckley, a conservative to his core, say about what's going on with tariffs right now? And also, what would he make of? Does he actually take Trump seriously that we're going to bring manufacturing back to the United States, given the fact that we live in an automated world? Like these jobs aren't coming back. I mean,
Well, have
they're
you ever
not.
looked at it's one of the most dispiriting charts in the world if you're Donald Trump and you know literally nothing about technological progress or how the economy is developed. Have you ever looked at manufacturing output versus employment? It's a graph, it's just a line graph.
No.
Manufacturing output goes way up and employment goes way down because manufacturing becomes much more efficient through automation, through a bunch of other
Right.
things.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so this idea of, and China has really gone all in on manufacturing. They've done this for a long time, and they're obviously becoming more technologically advanced with how they, you know, there's recently a Friedman article, which is kind of a classic Friedman article where he goes to some other country and he marvels at how advanced it is. He has been doing this for decades, but he's
Right.
talking about the dark factories in China. So there are all these factories. They never have to turn on the lights because every single thing working in there is a robot, and they're working 24 hours a day. But
Mm.
yeah, the United States did farm a lot of its manufacturing out to other countries because it's an extremely high tech and innovative economy. It's an extremely service based economy. These are just things that have changed, and you can bring back some manufacturing jobs, sure. Will you create some manufacturing renaissance where it's just like the 50s, you know, and you have just like a 30-year career at Makita Tools or whatever and a pension? No, I mean we're just not bringing that world back. And then
Oh no.
tariffs are insane because they're simultaneously inflationary and recessionary. Like this is like
Right.
what
Yeah.
this is the key to stagflation. They've figured it out. They've inserted it into the keyhole. Like
Mm-mm.
this is the Fed is not going to know what to do because we're going to have prices going way up. And then you
Mm-hmm.
also have the risk of the economy cooling and like GDP projections are already plummeting. So what's the
Mm-hmm.
Fed to do when prices because the Fed really wants to arrest price rises. We just went through a horrible period of inflation, which is why we have President Trump. And
Right.
it's going to be left at this horrible, horrible position where there's just no right, there's no right choice. And Trump has just manufactured this. None of it had to happen.
Trump now is actually even predicting a recession, and it's one that he caused. Like, how is it that he? I like to do whataboutism. Everybody says it's unfair, blah blah blah. But we have to in a situation like this because I'm like, if a Democratic president, if Joe Biden were to say what I'm about to do is going to cause a recession potentially, I mean, I feel like the heads of people would explode, like in the conservative movement. Now all you have are a bunch of Trump apologists going on a tour of like, that's just got to happen sometimes. I mean, it's long term, blah blah blah. And I'm just sitting there thinking, what about every time a liberal brings up, we need to start taking care of the environment, and then they're like, that's long term, we're not cool with that, we got to do short term. I'm just like, what? This is insane how you can just turn on a dime because you have a guy that you're so scared. It is obvious to me that you're so scared of his constituents, which is only like, the 37% or whatever that are just diehard MAGA that will never be shaken off. Why do we have politicians that are so scared of this man when he's saying insane things? Do you see like what do you say about that though, as far as like him not getting any backlash from the right as far as his talk on recession?
Oh, well, I mean, it's just a personality cult. I mean, that's just obvious. Like what you said about the double standards a second ago. Imagine, if you will, if Joe Biden had invited George Soros into the White House and had him
Right.
cut and had him fire a bunch of veterans, people at the VA, people working at the veteran suicide hotline. How do you think that would play on the right?
That's insane. Yeah.
I
That, and
mean, it's
also,
just like they have no principles, obviously.
can you imagine if Joe Biden were to bring in Bill Gates to just stand beside him in the White House and just start barking orders at everybody? Again, I try to play these things in my head, and I'm just like, people's heads would explode, I think, because they would just be like, this is clear corruption. And now you have the richest man in the world. By the way, you have evangelicals who now love Musk for some reason, like all these people. I'm like, all of you people that were end timers and are end timers that think that the rapture is going to happen and there's going to be a brain or a chip put in your brain. Wouldn't you think, by the way, I don't believe any, I'm an atheist, but like, wouldn't you think though that these people would be thinking, isn't this who we're talking about? He's a powerful guy, richest man in the world, and he's actually putting chips in people's, or attempting. And I'm not against that. I actually think that could potentially help people.
Yeah,
But
yeah, sure.
again, it's like I'm pointing out the cognitive dissonance here that goes on within the minds of a lot of these voters, and I'm just like, um, I live in Trump country, by the way. I'm in North Florida, so in Jacksonville,
Yeah,
Florida.
I'm from Salina, Kansas.
Okay, yeah. So Trump country is what.
My whole family, except for my brother. One of
do,
my brothers is anti-Trump like me, and then literally everybody else, every aunt, uncle, cousin. Yeah,
Do you have? Is it hard for you to like speak with your family on these matters, or
it's gotten to a point where it just doesn't come up all that often. I
right?
mean, it did used to, but yeah, it's just like, and yeah, there's nothing to do. My parents are pretty old, and I don't want to waste time arguing about this stuff. It's for one, there's no profit in it. Like, I don't think I'm changing any minds. I mean, at this point, like, the more outrageous Trump is, the more people will batten down the hatches. Like, you defend, you circle the wagons when you feel threatened, and that's
Mm,
one of the twisted, like, pathologies of Trumpism, is that the more indefensible he becomes, the more fervent his defenders become. So this is just this
right.
endless ratchet. So yeah, there's really no conversation to be had. And, like, I mean, I'll say, like, the economy was actually pretty strong under Biden. We had the soft landing, unemployment stayed under 4% for like 16 months or something. Like, that's a really extraordinary. Like, the Biden economy just wasn't that bad. I mean, I'm sorry, it just wasn't. Like,
Right.
there were
Oh yeah.
long stretches where wage growth was actually outpacing inflation. That did happen periodically throughout the whole thing. I understand that inflation is very difficult for people and painful, but the whole world went through inflation. This was a post-COVID supply shock. Like, if you're going to say that government policy was to blame for inflation, well, how about the trillions of dollars in aid that the Trump administration authorized and that Donald Trump literally put his name to? Like, it's just like this.
Right.
It was so frustrating to have arguments with people and say, like, well, actually, the economic picture is quite good. Most economists didn't think we were going to have a soft landing. They didn't think we were going to be able to lower inflation like we did without a recession. And then we just did. And then Biden got no
Right.
credit for it. And now Trump could have taken credit for that economy. And that's what I was afraid of. But it's so much worse than that. He's taking
Right.
credit for the 2 seconds of good economy we have, and then he's just going to tank it, and then he's going to blame that on Biden somehow. So
Man, it's bonkers. Okay, I think that I just saw my family show back up outside. We'll do like a couple more minutes here. I told my wife we'd go till 12:30. Um, they went to the park while I did this in this particular room.
it's reasonable.
Yeah. So before we talk, is there anything that you wanted an overall thought? There's so much that we could get to talking about his. I was going to talk about his cabinet and just RFK, Tulsi
Oh
Gabbard,
my
Cash
God,
Patel,
yeah, I've
all
written a
these
lot
people.
about all of them.
So I mean, it's just it's like a rogues gallery of insanity. But is there like an overall thought that you have about this administration, just to sort of put a pin on this whole conversation that we've had so far? As far as like, what is your biggest criticism right now, or your biggest fear, if you have one, about what Trump's up to currently?
My biggest fear is definitely his, I guess, his anti-globalism, broadly defined. I mean, it's just the utterly pointless attacks on our friends, our neighbors, the countries that have always been closest to us. The idea of waging a trade war on Europe, telling Europe that they should have nothing to do with the negotiations over Ukraine. Like that's
Yeah.
actually what Trump's envoy to Ukraine and Russia originally said. That guy just got demoted. Now he's just the envoy to Ukraine.
Mm,
But he said that yeah, Ukraine, the Europeans just aren't going to have any role here. And then at the same time, you have Hegseth at the Munich Security Conference saying that the Europeans are going to have to completely like reinforce Ukraine. They're going to have to like police any ceasefire line there is. So we're asking them to do much more, threatening them constantly with economic warfare, and threatening to withdraw the American security umbrella entirely.
mm,
Um, so that's just all insane. Like there's no purpose for any of it. The United States defense infrastructure in Europe is extremely solid. It's been there for 80 years. So this like the idea that I think there's a good chance Trump will withdraw from NATO. I mean, I just think that that means like I think Putin will probably take the it's it's very, very like iffy when you start predicting what will happen broad geopolitical terms. But you do have to think if there was ever going to be a time to invade Taiwan, if there was ever going
mm.
to be a time for Putin to try to break NATO by sending some troops, maybe some little green men like he did in Crimea into
Right.
Estonia, um, now would be it. I mean, that now would be the time.
Yeah.
So it's not that I think that will happen necessarily. There are a lot of reasons why it won't, but it's just that I feel Trump has increased the likelihood of all that so dramatically. And
Hmm.
that's what I find more alarming than anything. I mean, I find that worse. Like watching just the decay of the liberal international order right before our eyes is scarier than anything else Trump can do. I mean, and that's in some sense that even includes, I don't know, because what he's doing to American democracy is so atrocious too. Like it's just it's all part of the same project, I suppose, at the end of the day. Like
Man,
it's like a
yes.
return to there's this concept that Francis Fukuyama discusses in his Origins series. So he
Hmm.
wrote these two books, The Origins of Political Order and Political Order and Political Decay. And
Mm,
Fukuyama says it's kind of like the sequel to The End of History, where he talks about the process of actually building liberal democracy, like how, because, if your argument is that liberal democracy is the most sustainable form of government, then it's interesting to discuss like the mechanics of how it gets established, how it lasts, why it's sustainable, and all these things. And
mm,
basically the theme of those two books was that the enemy of the liberal state, the modern liberal democratic state, is patrimonialism. So it's just the
mm.
idea that you give your friends and you give your supporters like benefits that you don't give to others. You no longer have an objective civil service, an impartial civil service. You have a state that is oriented around a personality. It's oriented around patrimony. And he
Right.
was he was like I'm a huge fan of Fukuyama. You've probably seen that in some of my work.
Oh
I
yeah.
still think that the end of history thesis is alive and well. Like I mean, it's funny that people act like every single time something bad happens in the world that the thesis has been exploded. I just don't think that's true. I still think liberal
Mm,
democracy is the most sustainable system. But yeah, he just identified this particular threat to it, and this has become really common now. Like there was a great article in the Atlantic recently about like the return of patrimonialism.
mm.
And so, yeah, the destruction of the state from within, the destruction of the system of alliances and economic agreements we have and abroad, like it's all just so bad. It's hard to
Yeah.
pinpoint the worst thing, you know?
Man, I think that ultimately, I think I agree with you on this. I haven't seen anything like this in my lifetime. I don't think that if we think about the past, I'm just trying to think about past presidents that were extreme isolationists, or not even that adored authoritarians. I'm just
I don't think there's
nothing.
ever really been a president like that. That's
Yeah,
the creepy thing. Like,
nothing comes to mind.
yeah,
It's like
yeah.
pretty bad. But anyways, yeah, man. How Hitchens Can Save the Left, Matt Johnson's newest book. Again, I bought it. I think that this is just a fantastic book. I went through this thing. I listened to it first, and I went through it again with just read it whenever we last spoke. This is a dense book, by the way. I highly recommend everybody read Matt's stuff. I love it. It's always clear. His Substack, Notes on Globalism, is what it's called.
Yeah.
Yeah, or you can just Google Matt Johnson. And I think that honestly, I think that you influence a lot of people that are uh, deep thinkers too, as far as I can tell, because people,
Yeah, we'll see. That's
yeah, people that
thanks. I
are,
mean, thanks for the kind words, man. I really appreciate that.
yeah,
Thanks for reading the Hitchens book. Yeah, it's actually been out for a while now. I guess that came out Valentine's Day 2023.
it
It's
actually
almost
too.
two
It's
years
not
old.
it totally, and this is a timeless book. You would think that since it's talking about a figure and it's talking about the current, it kind of goes. I mean, because you go a lot through his whole idea with Iraq. That's actually a big portion of the book. You sort of relitigate a lot of that stuff. I think it's, I mean, this will be something you can look back on. Did you actually write other books as well? It seems like I
No,
saw
that's my
that.
only one.
Oh,
I've got
okay.
some ideas for a future book, but yeah, I don't even want to try to articulate those on a podcast because they're very inchoate at the moment.
Right,
But
right.
yeah, the Hitchens
But
book.
my thing is,
No, no, go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say, like writing, just to end this off here, just because you mentioned it, writing is something I'm currently doing. I write on a Substack as well, but I stopped doing it recently because I'm trying to work on this other thing, and anytime I get stuck on politics for too long, it takes me. My interests really lie with science and philosophy of science, but and the thing about writing is so funny, and your ideas do become sort of disparate while you're writing, because I'll be writing a chapter and I'm sitting here looking, and I'll end up having to read just for one paragraph like 10 books just to get through this thing sometimes, or at least
Yeah.
look into 10 books to try to figure out my ideas and get them down. So one idea leads to another, and it just turns into, oh my God, this is like taking way longer than I thought, because I have to, you know, put everything into context and backtrack. Do you find, does that happen to you when you're writing, where you're
Oh
like having
yeah,
to,
yeah. No,
yeah.
it's well. There's always. So I have a really bad habit of. I start to feel very uncomfortable if I'm not working. If I'm not actually, because I work independently. So when I'm not writing, I'm just suddenly not making money. Like it's
Right, right. Yeah.
yeah. You got
Oh,
the
man.
creditors at the door. No, I'm just kidding. But
Yeah.
no, I mean, I like I start doing research. Sometimes I'll just go through periods where I'm just reading, and like I mentioned the Origins series, Fukuyama series. I remember reading that and just taking, like 100 pages of notes a few years ago. And those are like the most valuable periods for me because it really focuses your mind. Like it forces you to engage very deeply with good arguments. And then like you'll find that over the course of subsequent years, 100 articles will get produced out of that period because but you have to like this is what the poverty of our sort of podcast culture now is that so many people like have to just pump out the content all the time, and it does
Right.
lead to your Candace Owenses and your other, and they're so tedious. Like people, yeah, they should try to read some Popper or some Fukuyama. Like it's
Yeah, it's
worth your
actually,
time.
somebody should actually take, this happens a lot. I don't know if you ever thought about this, but somebody should take your, because a lot of your writings have a through line to them. You could actually take yours and just put them in an essay book, which is often what people do. Have you ever thought about
Yeah.
that? Just,
Well,
yeah.
I'd probably have to have a little bit more cachet for any publisher to be interested in taking
Oh
those.
yeah, oh
Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, but I just as you write the essays, like you form ideas for books. Like you have sort of, you really do need grand narratives in life. Like it sounds kind of grandiose and silly, but
Oh no, yeah.
you need to have a frame. And I just think that's actually how you can ground your thought ethically as well. Like, I mean, I
Hmm.
sort of universalism is just sort of like the word under which all of my political philosophy can be found. You know, like I was heavily influenced by Peter Singer, like the Expanding Circle.
Oh
And
yeah, yeah.
yeah, and there's just like this is just something that always crops up in every thinker that I admire. I mean, even like Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics, they were very cosmopolitan. Like that was, and that's
Hmm.
I've always been attracted to Stoicism as well. So it's
No,
just
yeah, I
yeah,
think you're right. I mean, with um, yeah, hypothetico deductivism, that's what Popper puts forward, which is the idea that he says that all observation is theory laden. So what he's saying there is that you're always going to have a theory in mind, no matter if you're trying not to or not. It's just that are these facts? Is the theory that you have, is it putting in play describing the facts and their connections that you're currently seeing. And if it's not, then your theory is falsified. But you can actually apply that to politics and what you're talking about right now. You do have to have some sort of framework to be working on. And actually, you do whether you like it or not.
yeah,
So, like,
yeah, that's
and
true.
then the thing is to, some people are good at articulating it, some people are good at noticing it, and some people go through life and they never ever pinpoint what their theory of life ever was. And to me, um, that's kind of sad. But I mean, if you're enjoying life, I guess it doesn't really matter. Um, but anyways, man, Matt Johnson, it's awesome again having you. Hopefully, we can talk again in the future.